so I think this is a really great conclusion. I thank you very much for your introduction today, and it opens very much the virus conversation. So thank you again. And we can move then to Grammenos. So Grammenos, we were very honored for him to be opening the Climate Social Forum. So Grammenos, before you begin, I think maybe you want to give one sentence of your role for those who weren't able to watch the opening ceremony. And yes, please proceed with your presentation. He's going to focus especially on climate and migration. So thank you again for being with us today, Grammenos.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. Good afternoon, my friends. I'm not sure you can see your screen because...
Yes, we can. It's just very zoomed in, so I advise you to click on...
all right.
There you go. Thank you. And we hear you very well.
Fantastic. So, as Paula said, we are getting into a terrible period, but also a marvelous one. Because finally we're understanding that things that we thought were very far apart are actually very much connected. That there is no environmental balance without social balance, that justice is protective to the environment and not vice versa. It is surfacing not only in theory, in our understanding, but also in things that are happening lately. One of them is the pandemic, which is obviously linked with the mistreatment of our environment. Another one, it is not by chance that at the same time in which we start to realize that protecting our territories, our planet is important, that we start to realize that we didn't do it enough. We're also coping phenomena that should have been forgotten in history, wars, forced migrations. So this is an issue that was totally forgotten before, but that now is becoming, how would I say, popular. Climate and migration, climate and conflicts. And today we will focus especially on migrations because they are important everywhere. They are climate related, but we will have to start saying that whenever you hear about climate migration, you're hearing about something that does not exist. There is no climate-induced migration, because what climate is causing is forced population movements. And there is a big difference between someone who migrates and someone who is forced out of his home. We'll have to understand it a little bit better to get to the rest of our analysis. People tend to think that the poorer you are, the more you are inclined to migrate. But this is strictly not true. When you're too poor, you cannot migrate. You just have to cope with urgencies so immediate that you cannot contemplate going somewhere else. Your day-to-day challenge is to have your bowl of rice, and you don't even have those 20 cents that would allow you to pay someone to stay outside a truck bringing you to the next village. The migrant, instead, is someone who has already attained a certain level of income, a certain level of possibility to plan for the future. When you start thinking about going somewhere else, it is because you want to make your life better and because you have more or less the means to do so. The difference is not only in the causes, it is also and very much in the nature of the phenomena. Because migrants, that is, those who have at least a small part of free choice in their option to move somewhere else, generally can be beneficial to themselves, to their community, and to the new community they're going to. Why? Well, they are obviously beneficial to themselves because if they do it well, they will attain a new level in quality of life. When they go to hosting communities, they bring their experience, they bring their income generation. In many cases, this is, for instance, the case of Italy. They participate in rebalancing the demographic pyramid. It is well known that in richer countries, population is shrinking, birth rate is falling very rapidly, and this is something that poses a big problem for economic systems. For instance, for paying retreats, for pensions to retreated people, and of course they are beneficial to their own communities. Why? In a way that makes them beneficial also to the new hosting communities. Let's take the case of Africa from the point of view of my country, Italy. Africa is just in front of Italy. And if Africa explodes, becomes unstable, it is not only Africa's problem, it is also the problem of Italy, of the rest of Europe, and of the rest of the world, because its instability is contagious. It can be the birthplace of new forms of trafficking, terrorism, illegal activities, and all the rest, besides the fact that a continent which is unstable cannot be an area of economic cooperation. Once you might have thought that you could go there to open your restaurant, but if it becomes totally insecure, you cannot do it anymore. So it is an absolute urgency for everyone to help Africa stay stable and progress in a fair way. But how do we do that? Generally, we do that through an instrument called development cooperation. Development cooperation is very good. It's very helpful, but it is inherently inefficient. That is that if you devote $1 million, for instance, for a program in a certain African village through development cooperation, it means that only one part of it will actually arrive to the village, maybe 600,000, 700,000. The rest is used to organize the program, to pay the people who participate to it, to pay the banks for transferring money and all the rest. And where is this money coming from? It comes from the taxes of the people who live in richer countries. But what do migrants do, the free migrants? Well, they do development cooperation at no cost and in a much more efficient way, because they normally send back money home, and the money they send has no administrative cost and generally gets dollar by dollar exactly where it is most needed. So in this sense, when we talk about migrants, we talk about a rebalancing mechanism that is beneficial to everyone. Of course, it has to be managed, but it is potentially beneficial to everyone. This is not the case with climate change. Climate change does not cause migrants, because if an environmental event arrives that affects productivity, generally it can be absorbed by the same people who can start thinking about migrating. If you are rich enough to contemplate migrating, normally you're rich enough also to face a season of drought. Those who cannot face the season of drought are also those who cannot contemplate migrate. So what does it mean? It means that you have desperate people becoming even more desperate, and you're forcing them out. And it makes a big, big difference, because if the migrant, the real migrant, the one that has at least partly freely chosen to migrate, can be beneficial to himself, to his community, and to the new hosting community, the person who is forced to move is harming himself, his original community, and everyone else. Why? Not because he is particularly wicked, but because he is in desperation. And when you are in desperation, you become the prey and the tool of everything which is illegal and mean. If you have to go away and you don't have any money, you have no security, you will be recruited by traffickers, if you're lucky, because otherwise you will be killed by traffickers. And this is what we have to fight against, not migration, which is in itself, let me stress it again, a very powerful and useful rebalancing system, but the tragedy of people being forced away from their home. So, what part of climate change forces people at home? We have to understand that medias are often wrong when they talk about this. They link migration with the so-called extreme weather events like tornadoes or floods. These are, of course, destructive, but generally they are episodic, short-term phenomena. And what they do is that either they make people move for some time until they can go back, or they make people move for short distances. Like you used to live in the bottom of the valley starts being more and more flooded. It doesn't mean that you go to Switzerland. It means that you move your home 100 meters higher. So what is instead really making people migrate is another kind of situation. It's the so-called slow onsets, large-scale phenomena like desertification. And above all, the fact that climate becomes uncertain, unpredictable. In a more energetic atmosphere, like the one which is characterized by the greenhouse effect, that makes us store in our energy as much as the equivalent of the explosion of 400,000 atom bombs per day, climate becomes violent and unpredictable. It's only normal. If you put more energy in a closed system, it becomes a frenzy, chaotic. But if climate is unpredictable, also nature becomes unpredictable, because climate is the clockwork of nature. And if everything is unpredictable in nature, especially if you are in a poor country, also you cannot plan your life. You cannot organize your society. You cannot decide when you're going to harvest or when you're going to plant your seeds. This puts in motion less visible dynamics, but which are much more powerful. A slowly growing desertification is less visible than a tornado, but it's moving much more people than a tornado. I'll give you an example. I've also shown it on my first intervention at the beginning of the social forum, showing you a map of the northern part of Africa, which is made up mainly of deserts. The desert is not a generous ecosystem. Yet there are some populations who have found a way of life which is compatible with the desert. Except that today we do not only have the deserts that have been deserts for thousands of years. We also have a somehow new phenomenon, an active area, which is the area of desertification. Now, if you put objectively on the plates of the scale, the generosity of the ecosystem in the desert and the generosity of the ecosystem in the area of desertification, the latter remains more generous. It is becoming harder and harder, but still you have more fruits, you have more yield in the area of desertification and then in the middle of the Sahara. But there, in this area, you have climate that changes, nature that changes, and so you cannot organize your life, you cannot organize your production, you cannot organize the village. You see where it is located, and you might notice that this area coincides with the area of concentration of hunger and conflicts, the area of concentration of terrorist dynamics, the area of concentration of illegal trafficking of many sorts, weapons, drugs, human beings, and whatever you want, name it, you've got it. And see from where 9 out of 10 of those migrants that reached Europe and that basically destabilized European Union, European unity, although it was somehow not necessary, 9 out of 10 of them come from there. The 10th comes from Bangladesh, which is also suffering severe impacts of a distorted nature, especially with the salinization of its coasts, due again to climate change. What happens? Environmental modifications cause the randomization of ecosystem services, of the fruits of nature, which already makes it impossible for you to organize any activity, not only rural activities like harvesting, but also urban management activities like planning the distribution of water. If you don't have the slightest idea of when it will rain, you don't know how to organize the distribution of water. So on one side, we have climate change that is randomizing the behavior of nature and making it very difficult for human communities, especially in poorer countries, to organize their production and lives. On the other side, you have contraction, loss, or displacement of these services, which are so essential for us. You know, we think about ourselves as a technological society, basically not really depending on nature, because we think that we have substituted nature in everything, but it is strictly not true. It is not true in advanced countries, and it is even more untrue in poorer countries. We have to rely on nature for productivity, but also for having clean water. Humid zones do that. The services provided to us by nature are huge, and they arrive to the point of being a question of gender balance or cultural identity. If you don't believe me, well, the disappearance of one single plant can make or break the role of women in certain areas, because during centuries, their social and productive role has been spinning around the use of that specific bush, which can be a medicine bush, cosmetic production plant, or this kind of things. So what happens with climate change is that it creates the condition for disputes. Whenever you have been relying on some resources and then they vanish, and even worse, they move from one place to the other, you can be sure that there's going to be a fight about it. If the situation is well controlled, there is good governance, and the economy is not so bad, these fights are normally regulated. They are in front of courts or this kind of situations. But if we are in a more fragile situation, they become open fights. And if you want, we can give it a name. For instance, the Sudan War was about the displacement of wells. All this fragilization obtains the poorest of the poorest and makes them, again we say migrate, but actually forcibly move somewhere else. This mix altogether integrates the most dangerous dynamic that we have to face when we come to tackling climate change. Climate change is dangerous for many reasons, and it is slipping out of hand. Scientists tell us that we have less than 10 years to keep it under control, to change route, because if we don't do that, we kickstart feedback loops that will make our planet warm very, very quickly. I don't have the time to explain them, but you can look them up. There are 11 feedback loops, like the albedo feedback loops, which concerns ice, the permafrost feedback loop, that concerns the melting of the frozen soils of the north. There are feedback loops with clouds and many more. If we don't stop our warming fast enough, all these loops will become very, very quick, and will get our own planetary system to shift to a new balance, which is 3 to 4 or maybe 5 degrees warmer than now. And the shifting, the period in which it transits from one balance to another balance, will for sure not be an easy one for mankind. So this is what scientists point out as the real danger of time. We only have less than 10 years to avoid entering into dynamics that will make, before the end of the century, our planet something that they define a hot house Earth, an oven Earth. An Earth which is 4 degrees warmer, because we have kick-started those automatic systems that bring temperature even higher up than what we have done so far, is a planet that will witness the extinction of 8 species out of 10. And then it's a planet without biodiversity, a planet where we will have to struggle for food, where we will not have resources, etc. But there is another feedback loop, another cycle, which is nature, mankind nature, which is even more dangerous. Again, when you hear about climate change scenarios, normally they quote as the worst possible scenario the so-called business as usual. If we stay business as usual, that is, if we do what we have been doing lately, we can start those cycles I was talking about before, those nature-to-nature feedback loops, like the permafrost thawing, or or other ones, and this will bring temperature to increase up to 4 degrees. But a business as usual scenario is really actually very optimistic, because already at the beginning of these cycles, mankind cannot stay business as usual. Especially the poorest parts of the world will get into destabilization. And there is another loop. Environmental stress with climate change will cause, as I explained before, societal collapse, conflict. But then a society that enters into collapse and conflict cannot afford to take care of its environment. Taking care of your environment is about the future, but when you are in an emergency situation, you don't see the future. You only see today. And then if you need to give something to eat to your children, you don't care if tomorrow this will be a disaster, you go and cut a forest or something like that. So you cause even more environmental stress, and the situation restarts amplified over and over again. So this is a tragedy for the poorer countries, but it is a tragedy for everyone, because we need to stay below the limits of warming. If we go beyond 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we enter into those warming, and this will be unmanageable by anyone, not even the richest countries. But we cannot stay below 2 degrees if we don't have the poorest on board. Because, if 60, 70% of the economy is managed by rich countries, it is also true that 70% of the planet's surfaces, both lands and sea, have to be managed sustainably, have to be cultivated with sustainable agriculture, have to be protected in their pristine forest areas, and so on. If we don't allow poor countries to do that, then we will all lose our race to stay in a viable climate, and mankind as a whole will suffer. There is a very powerful message by Mother Earth in this cycle. Mother Earth tells us that we have to rush first to help the poorest among the poor, which is also a point that was mentioned by Paula when she said that the basic principle of the 2030 agenda is no one left behind. It is not a question of ethics or morals. It is functional. System Earth is sustainable only if we rush first to protect the poor. And we can do that. We can do that. If we don't do that, we are starting a planetary-wide cycle of destabilization. Because if we don't protect the societies that are more fragilized by climate change, we don't protect mankind there where terrorism, fanaticism, illegal activities are easier to start. And it is to the detriment of all, not only of them. Climate change is indeed already doing that. I'm showing you the pictures of a lake. You've probably already heard about it. It's now a very well-known tragedy, Lake Chad. Lake Chad historically has always had a tendency to variability in its surface and depth. It always shrank or expanded a little bit, except that in the last 40 years, it shrunk 18 times. Now, I don't know where you come from. I'm talking to those who are listening to me, but I imagine most of you are Europeans. Imagine, just close your eyes and imagine if the Mediterranean shrunk 18 times in 40 years. On the North Rim of the Mediterranean, you basically have rich countries that belong to an integrated economic system, but it will be a tragedy for them too. Imagine Athens that instead of the Piraeus port has an extent of crackled mud with boats leaning like that because they cannot be used. Imagine tourist industries along the coast. Imagine all those temperature regulating functions provided by the Mediterranean that are so essential to our agriculture. Imagine all the fishing industries being destroyed. It would be unmanageable for rich countries. Well, around Lake Chad, there are no rich countries. There are 4 fragile countries. And this is, of course, accelerating destabilization. But this is only one part of the story. The problem is that Lake Chad, by being a large extent of water, was acting as a stabilizer of climate. It made climate predictable, and in predictability of climate, agriculture could be managed better. You knew what to do in March, April, May, because climate was always the same, predictable, repeating itself. Now that Lake Chad has shrunk, it is not only a tragedy for fishermen who cannot fish anymore, and so they have to become farmers, but where are the lands for them to farm and this kind of things? The problem is that this climate insecurity, this unpredictability, has destroyed one of the basic mechanisms of peace in the region. In this region, two communities live along or have lived along quite peacefully. The farmers and the shepherds. The farmers stay on the lands, the shepherds are nomadic. There is obviously a potential for conflict between those two communities, but it was regulated by a predictable climate, because at a certain time of the year, farmers knew that it was convenient for them to have shepherds enter their lands, because with their beasts, they were fertilizing the lands. It is a question of poo, but it was an essential question of poo. Now that Lake Chad does not exert anymore this regulation function, climate has become unpredictable. You don't know anymore when this kind of trade-off can be performed, and all this together is one of the reasons why we're witnessing to the growth of people like Boko Haram, which is a terrible terrorist formation. Boko Haram would have been born anyway, but it wouldn't be as important, as massive a phenomenon as it is today without climate change. This kind of destabilization, which is obviously at the source of many migration dynamics, of many forced population, has occurred also as one of the causes of the Syrian crisis, of the ISIL mobilization. As an important cause, it concurred to the violent part of Arab Springs. It is casting extremely severe shadows on Asia, because, for instance, with the thawing, the melting of Himalayan glaciers, you will have the lack of a function performed by glaciers, which is absolutely essential for the people in the valleys. South of the Himalaya, the climate is monsonic. It means that that there is a dry season that alternates with a very wet season. And what do glaciers do? Glaciers store the excess water during the wet season and release it gradually during the dry season through a network of rivers that irrigates plains where 1.4 billion people live. If glaciers collapse, it means not only a tragedy for the people in the mountains, which are not few people, 113 million persons live in the mountains and they depend directly from their ecosystem. There are immediate risk of migration, but it is also a tragedy for peoples in the valleys, because without rivers, they will have to cope with an unmanageable alternance of floods and drought that will destroy the entire infrastructure and most of their food security. To make a long story short, climate change is now dangerous where we find an overlapping between a fragile and exposed ecosystem and a fragile society. And this kind of situation has now been identified in 69 different areas of the world. And it is becoming more and more potentially dangerous. There was a new study released by an Australian think tank just 2 weeks ago that calculates the migration potential. And again, let me stress that this is not migration, this is forced population movement, but forced population movements is too long a word, so let's call it migration. Anyway, the potential for migration induced by climate and nature disruption, according to this think tank, is 1.2 billion people. Well, imagine that the European Union cohesion almost collapsed with the arrival of 1 million people from Syria and 380,000 people from the Sahel. What will happen if you're not smart enough, if hundreds of millions of people start moving? My time is running out. I don't want to give only a gloomy picture. Solutions are there, solutions are possible. Things can be done to stop all this. And by the way, these are things that can, if you want to get into this kind of activities, you can make a lot of money. For instance, recovering degraded lands is an investment that pays generally 7%. It's not too difficult to undergo, and it's there for companies to start, and not only for governments. There are all these solutions that Paola has underlined. They're open there. They can be an opportunity to produce income, to integrate economies, to rebalance poverty. And once again, we see how protecting nature is also a factor of justice and peace. I really hope you now have a better glimpse of this incumbent problem. We hear about it, we tend to consider it as a pathological, dangerous, but little aspect of the climate change problem. Well, you tell me, if 1.5 billion people desperately on the move is a little problem. If you allow me, if you're interested in a better analysis of these questions that I've rapidly touched upon, and you can read Italian, there is a book of mine written with a climatologist called Antonello Pasini called Effetto Serra, Effetto Guerra. It is now being translated in English with the title Global Warming, Global War. And there's a new one, but this is only in Italian. It's entering the bookshops on the 12th of January, which is called Butterfly Effects. And it is about the 6th P that Paola mentioned. Your personal motivation, all you can do, and how powerful you are as an individual in changing the situation and saving the future for you and your children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grammenos, for your presentation. I've actually had the pleasure to see your slides previously, and I always find it very interesting